We talked a little bit about some of the components of what a strategic planning system is all about.
And one of the things that we believe that is very important is for us to take a look at the respective environments that we operate in.
So today we're going to learn about personality, the differences of personalities, and about relationships.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the HUD OCIO learning session. Welcome to those here in the audience, and special welcome to those who are watching us on the internet. So today we have a very interesting discussion planned. We're going to be discussing design thinking. Now, for those of you who watch regularly, you know that we've talked about this before. Several months ago, we did a presentation on design thinking. And today we have with us Dr. Jeffrey Seaver from the National Defense University, who's going to be talking to us about it. Talking with us about it. Dr. Seaver is a professor now at the National Defense University, and his specific interests and research are around systems thinking and design thinking. So with that, Jeff, why don't we get started?
Great. Thanks for the introduction. The title of today's presentation is Design Thinking and National Security Strategy for Uncertain Futures. This is the title of a course that I developed based on some research I've been doing over the last 10 years that I taught last year at National Defense University. What I thought we'd do is sort of break the title down into its components and talk about each of the basic components. So we're going to try and cover design thinking, national security strategy, but more specifically strategy, and we'll also talk about this notion of uncertain futures. And the real driver behind this particular presentation and course is the application of design thinking and the tools, techniques, and methodologies that you could derive from design thinking to deal with this idea of uncertain futures. So let's start with this discussion of strategy. National security strategy is clearly one of the prime topics at National Defense University. And this is obviously a very high-level government strategy signed by the President of the United States. But how does national security strategy, or the tools used to develop a national security strategy, relate to what each of you do on a day-to-day basis? In many organizations, the people who work there don't see themselves as having a role in the development of the strategy at their agency or the strategy within their department, or strategy in general. They seem to think that strategy is something that's done by the folks who work in the strategic planning office, like Melanie.
Well, not exactly, but...
Or that strategy is something that's, strictly the purview of the senior leadership of the organization. And they don't see that they have much of a role in strategy, or that they do strategy, or that it applies to them in any real way. So I thought we'd just take a few minutes and talk about strategy. Almost all of us engage in some sort of strategic activity. Now, just think back on your own career. How many of you are currently in the job at the pay grade you were in when you started your career 20 years ago? Anybody? No. Most of us have moved along. So how did that happen? Did that happen by random accident? Did somebody come into your office one day and say, hey, you'd be a really good GS-15 and promote you? No. Somehow you had to think about the future and try and develop a strategy for moving from that initial position that you were hired in at to the position you wanted at some point in the future, and probably some relatively distant point in the future, anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20 years. So all of us do strategy in our personal lives. Even going on a vacation requires that you do strategy. You have to think about what you're going to do, and then get the members of your family to agree to it. That's not necessarily the easiest task I can think of. Now, one approach to going on a family vacation is pretty simple. You could just get in the car and drive around the Beltway until you come to agreement on what exit to get off at. That's probably not going to lead to the best family vacation. So strategy is something most of you do, so you are familiar with it. It's thinking about the future. In general, you're thinking about a desirable future for yourself, your family, your organization. So to be a strategist, it does help to be optimistic, okay, to think about these positive, desirable futures. Within your organization, even within your work group, you're probably doing strategy, it's just not labeled strategy. You're probably thinking about the future of your organization, your organizational component, and trying to move it forward in some positive way so that you receive a positive outcome. So when we talk about strategy, it's not something reserved for senior leadership. It's not suddenly something you learn when you become a senior leader. It's something you probably already do, engage in, you just may not recognize it. Strategies are rated in a hierarchy. So, for example, at National Defense University, we start with this notion of national security strategy, national defense strategy, national military strategy, the national strategy for cybersecurity. So there are a plethora of strategic documents out there that try to capture the strategies of the organization or of the federal government. One of the key challenges to the national security strategy is the idea that you have to bring lots of disparate organizations together. One of the issues we will address a little bit later in the presentation is a methodology for doing that. The methodology we're going to talk about is, I call it a scalable methodology, because you can use it at the U.S. government level, you can use it at the agency level, anywhere where you're trying to pull disparate organizations together to sort of focus their activity to accomplish some outcome.
You know, Jeff, before we go on to the next slide, you know, you're going to be talking about a lot of really involved concepts in terms of strategy, design thinking, strategic planning, thinking in general, right? So if we talk just for another minute about what strategy is, because there's hundreds almost of definitions, and people throw the word around a lot. They say, think strategically, we got to develop a strategy, you know, we have to look at this strategically. You know, there's a lot of different ways to look at that. It's not necessarily, and it's important for people to understand, it's not necessarily this idea of long term. If anything, it's really not the idea of long term. It's more the idea of integrating and synthesizing a lot of disparate sort of ideas to make sense out of something so that it's useful. Would you agree with that?
One of the real keys to strategy is getting people to focus on the environment in which they're operating, the context. And the real key for a strategist is to invest significant effort in looking at that context. So if you're thinking, let's just go back to the career example again. Within your career example, you have to look at the context in which your career is going to advance over time. Now, part of that context is trying to understand the future environment in which you're going to be operating, in which you're trying to move your career ahead. So that context could be relatively far distant, 10, 15, 20 years, or maybe further, or it could be much closer in. One of the tasks that you have to engage in when you're engaging in strategy is you have to make a decision about what your planning or strategy time horizon is. So frequently in a career planning time horizon, you might look 10, 15, 20 years out, maybe further. But of course, you're not going to wait 10 or 15 or 20 years to actually engage in activities to get you to that next level in your career. You're going to start working on those activities today, with the recognition that that future environment could significantly change, and that plan that you put together has to be flexible enough so that you can change. I'll just take a simple example. There's two careers I was interested in when I was in college. Neither of those careers would keep me in housing, food, and clothing today if I was still in those careers. Okay? And I'm not that old. Okay? So it wasn't like I was making buggy whips or something like that. So you have to be flexible. But the general idea is you've at least got the basic outline or description of a desirable future and some general idea of how to get there, even though things might change.
Okay, great, thanks.
But yeah, there's tons of definitions of strategy.
Right.
All right, let's take a quick look. I thought we'd sort of maybe take a few minutes and just talk about, what is it about strategy, uncertain futures? What is it we're really trying to deal with? So the real challenge we're faced with is this issue in strategy. Strategy is really what makes strategy difficult, what makes it tough. Strategy is about wicked problems. Now, we've had a discussion of wicked problems in one of these OCIO learning sessions probably a couple of years ago. So let me just go over it briefly. There's a variety of ways to characterize wicked problems. I like to characterize wicked problems as those that have this feature called dynamic complexity. So there's a couple ways to think about dynamic complexity, but what we're faced with in most cases in the federal government or even state and local government is the idea that we're actually working with a large number of players, or in systems thinking we call them agents. So if you look on the left, the y-axis on your chart on the left-hand side, you'll see part of dynamic complexity is a result of this large number of interactions between agents, and the agents are pursuing their own self-interests. And there's no one in the system who can actually force the agents to cooperate. If the agents do cooperate, it's of their own agreement. So an example we might use in national security is if we take any of the current conflicts, either Afghanistan or Iraq, there is no one in the system who can force the agents who are pursuing their own interest to actually come to agreement on what the interests are and work together. Okay? There's nobody who could use coercion, for example. So you have to work with cooperative agreements, and the agents are only going to be cooperative as long as their self-interests are satisfied in the agreement. So one of the things we're dealing with in wicked problems is this notion that the agents are pursuing their own self-interest, and there's no central controller to force the agents, to coerce them to work together. One strategy sometimes employed is to use this notion of common goals. Well, in these wicked problems, generally there's no common goal that people are pursuing. The other key is that the feedback loop between when you actually do something, that is, you say implement a component of your strategy, or you take some action to deal with something, and the feedback loop as to whether or not that actually resulted in the outcome you expected is so long you'll never probably find out what happened. That is, the cause and effect relationships, linkages are long, and there's a lot of intervening variables. So you may never really know if the action you took resulted in the outcome you expected. One of the other major challenges with wicked problems is oftentimes the second and third order effects can have significant unintended consequences, which may be worse than the problem you tried to solve. So if you think about your own organization, many of the issues you're faced with today may have been created as the result of actions that were taken 10 years ago to solve some problem somebody identified 10 years ago. The final characteristic of a wicked problem is generally there's no solution. The best we can do with many of these wicked problems is to cope with them. We're never going to eliminate them. Okay, so it's a constant coping mechanism. They're never eliminated. They don't go away. You maybe just dampen them down and make them less worse. A couple of examples of wicked problems I've tried to include on the list here. Fairly common example of a wicked problem, although people might think it is a tame problem, is the notion of a supplier distribution network. So for example, one of the exercises we use in class is the exercise of the beer game. And the students have a fairly significant difficulty optimizing the beer game activity. It's a 4-player game. It only has 4 players. It's got relatively short delays, has a 4-week delay, and even in a simple four-player game, people have a very difficult time dealing with the short delays. And in general, the beer game goes to some crisis and collapses in the supplier distribution network. Okay. Any questions on this?
Yeah, anything from the audience on that? Because wicked problems are an issue that people also sometimes don't understand. And a lot of times they don't understand them because they're ill-defined. And so you have a problem like that if you think about in your own organizations, most of the problems within organizations, they're not, a lot of times they're not very well defined only because you're not thinking about all of the entire context of the problem, and you're not thinking about all the alternative solutions to the problem, because the thinking part, which Jeff is also going to talk about, of design thinking, it's the thinking part that's really the hard part. It's the thinking part and thinking through everything that's really difficult. Because I don't want to take any of your thunder away, Jeff, but just to add a little something, a lot of times there's this very rational sort of decision, stair-stepping kind of thing to solve a problem. You have a problem, you come up with an answer, and you think it's over. And what you're going to be getting into, Jeff, is really, it's not that way at all, particularly with design thinking. It's more about an iterative kind of idea, like you think you solve it, you see it morph, you try to solve it again, it goes back around because you have to continually look at the entire context of the issue. Is that true, Jeff?
Yeah, one of the key ideas you brought up there is, we'll talk a little bit about it, is this notion of framing. So one of the ways to sort of think about, try and identify a wicked problem is when people frame the problem is framed in such a way so that the solution is contained in the framing of the problem. So you see these actually quite a bit in organizations, particularly in systems and software development. People bring solutions to you, they don't bring problems to you. We don't have a local area network, therefore the solution is what? Get a local area network. We're not doing cloud computing. What's the solution? Cloud computing. Some of those are probably just technical issues, but frequently wicked problems, the solution is contained in the statement of the problem. So the real challenge with dealing with wicked problems is working on getting a really clear statement of the problem and this is where the conflict among the stakeholders come in. All the stakeholders have a different perspective on the problem. Let's take something that you may be somewhat familiar with here, homelessness among veterans. Well, as soon as I say homelessness among veterans, what's the solution? Homes for veterans. Somehow you have to do some housing, something. Well, okay. I might be able to talk about that particular issue from a different frame, which would give me a different solution set. So we'll talk a bit about framing, but one of the big challenges in wicked problems is coming to agreement among the stakeholders as to the statement of the problem.
Could you go to the microphone if you have a question? Thanks.
Dr. Sievert, one of the questions that I have, the question that I have is, a wicked problem, you said, you just kind of learn to cope with it. But in our environment, in a technology environment, it's like you have a problem, you need to have a solution. This issue of iterative going, it's say, we've been at this for 10 years and we haven't reached consensus. And that's just not, from an executive standpoint, that's not acceptable, right? And it shouldn't be acceptable because, at least you should be moving forward even though you didn't solve the problem completely. It's like we keep reframing the problem in different ways, and we still don't get to even what you said, a mitigating point.
Yeah, one of the interesting things with wicked problems is, and I think you made a good point there, is you can move forward on them, but you're never going to eliminate them. Right. Okay. That's why you find yourself constantly in this iterative cycle. So let's just take a simple example of in software development. The real key people talk about in software development systems acquisition is we have to get the user's requirements right. If we could only get the user's requirements right, then everything would just flow out from the analysis through implementation, right? That's basically the mantra you hear all the time. Well, after 40 years of developing software, the software industry is still struggling with how to get the user requirements right, because the users don't necessarily know what they want, and the users can't necessarily agree on what the solution's supposed to do. Software development is an example of a wicked problem, because you have lots of different perspectives on framing the issues, from the users all the way up to management through the organization. And the feedback, the development process, particularly if you use something like the waterfall model, can be a long time, can be 10 years. So what are some of the strategies for dealing with that? You pointed to a few of them, and that is to use incremental evolutionary design techniques. So you cut down the cycle time. So if you can cut the cycle time, the delay between when you collect the user's requirement and when you deliver on the user's requirement, the user can see whether or not it meets their requirement. And you can scope the requirement so it's relatively small. If you look on the chart, what is it you're doing? You're moving from a wicked problem to taming the problem to actually getting down to what? A small number of players and a relatively small task that can be accomplished relatively quickly that you can get feedback on. But the larger problem, the huge problem you started with, you're only, what, eating little bits and pieces as you go along. So it still may take a relatively long time to roll out the solution, but then, of course, the operating environment has changed. So you're going to start working on another solution. So it's that constant iterative process. But you're right, our rhetoric is focused on eliminating problems, solving problems. It's all about problem solving. One of the keys behind design thinking is we're trying to get people to move from this notion that being a leader is about solving problems and making decisions, to the notion that being a leader is about creating an environment in which we can better cope with the problems we're faced with. And it's about problem formulation, not about problem solving. Any more questions? Let's take a few minutes and talk about this idea of uncertainty. This is the way I like to sort of structure this discussion of uncertainty. There's sort of two rather broad features to the future, or uncertainty, one of which is structural uncertainty. The idea of structural uncertainty is there's a key set of variables that drive our business, and there's a relationship between those key set of variables. Now, the relationship is really the important part, but what we ought to be able to do is identify the key variables that drive our business, and then try and understand the relationship between those key variables. And actually, that's the relatively easy part of thinking about the future. The hard part of thinking about the future is figuring out what the value of any particular variable is going to be and when it's going to have that value. So let's take a simple example. I would assume many of you invest in thrift savings plan.
Looks like head shaking.
Looks like a few going up and down. Well, you probably have a pretty clear picture of what the key variables are and what their relationship are between those key variables. So then the real question is, what's going to be the value of any particular variable tomorrow? So if I knew the value of a key variable in the set of relationships, what it was going to be tomorrow, I could probably plug it into my model and make a decision about what direction my portfolio is going to go tomorrow. Now extend that out to some point in the future, 10 or 15 years, whatever your retirement date is, and the value, the variables and the relationships probably are going to remain relatively stable. The tricky part is figuring out what the value of any particular variable is going to be. So tomorrow, for example, is going to be hot, right? Well, exactly how hot? Is it going to be hotter than today? We know what the key variables are, but we don't know the exact temperature that it's going to be tomorrow. And the other question is, for me, is how hot is it going to be at 4:30 or 5 o'clock when I'm walking to the metro?
Or riding your bike home.
Or riding my bike home. I'm not going to be able to predict that today. But I know what the key variables are. I just don't know what the value of those key variables are. So,
Well, Jeff, I'm sorry. If we took a close look at your slide, and hopefully everybody can see the slide that's up there. So if we took a close look at your slide and we looked at where do most of the problems lie in terms of uncertainty for the future? Organizationally, where do you think we fall into in those quadrants from your experience?
the position we've taken, particularly in the class, but is in general, the structural uncertainty is moderate. So we're in that upper quadrant on the left, but the parameter uncertainty is high. So we generally know what the variables are. We have a pretty good idea what the relationships are. And we can actually sit down and map those out. What we don't know is the value of any particular variable at some point in the future. That's the part that's really hard to predict. So we're going to give up on prediction. And on this chart's also included a number of strategic planning methodologies or tools, which we'll talk a little bit about those in a minute. But you'll see the traditional method that most agencies use assumes that structural uncertainty is relatively low and parameter uncertainty is relatively low. So basically what they're saying is we know what all the variables are, we know what the relationship is, and we have a pretty good understanding of what the value of any particular variable is going to be within our planning horizon, which is frequently 5 years. That may not be true. Matter of fact, in many cases, that's not true. So the approach we're going to talk about is one that basically states that structural uncertainty is moderate. That is, I generally know what the variables are and I know what the relationships are, but I don't really know what the future value of any particular variable that drives the behavior of the system is. So I'm going to want to play with potential values. I'm going to do that through this, what I've called the new scenario planning methodology, which we'll talk about toward the end of the discussion.
Okay.
So are there any questions on uncertainty?
Okay. And we have another question from our audience.
So typically, it's good to have, that uncertainty and say, which parameters are we going to be working with? As a general rule, what do you think is the biggest downfall? Because when we deal with uncertainties, the budget comes into play. So based on how are you going to base your assumptions to drive a budget based on uncertainties? Because I think that's what, I think that's a very real problem, especially, in the way that the budgets are being cut left and right at this time.
That's a good question. What would the answer to that be, Jeff?
That's a great question. Well, there's a couple approaches to thinking about the relationship between planning and budgeting. Now, as a strategist or planner, generally our position is that the strategy should drive the budget. And the strategy should be one of the tools you use to negotiate with your stakeholders. For example, your key members of Congress. The purpose of doing the strategic plan under the GPRA is to use that as a tool to negotiate with stakeholders. That requires that you bring your stakeholders in relatively early on in the development of the strategy. That you build agreement among your stakeholders in the development of the strategy, so when it comes time to actually authorize expenditure of funds against the strategy, you've conducted the negotiations with your stakeholders already. Now, your plan needs to be resilient enough so that it can be responsive to changes in the authority to spend money on the strategy. and that you've got them, again, if you've got the parameters clearly identified and the relationship between the parameters identified, then one of the things you can do is you can run simulations against the model you've developed to try and get a better understanding of the impact of changes in the budget on the programs. Does that help?
Great.
Well, there's a couple different approaches to developing strategies that are connected to uncertainty. So the more traditional approach under the GPRA, for example, falls in that box in the lower left, on the left-hand side of your chart. And this tends to assume that the future is relatively known and knowable. Now, if it's relatively close, that might be true. But if you're doing planning more than a couple years out, that's probably not true. And in the current environment, that's probably not true. You're probably not going to be able to predict the future very accurately, even a couple of years out. There's just too much uncertainty in the environment. Another alternative approach to dealing with strategy is to develop different future scenarios and then assign probabilities to those scenarios. And then you could pick the scenario that has the preferred probability and then work toward that. There's always the notion of true ambiguity. Sometimes managers and strategists think they're in this box where the future is so unknowable that planning's a waste of time, so they don't want to engage in it at all. In general, we don't find ourselves in that box. I think today we find ourselves most frequently in this notion that what we need to look at is a landscape of futures, so that within a particular range, we can look at different futures. We're not going to assign probabilities to these futures. We're not going to claim that any of these futures will in and of themselves be realized. But what we need to do is be prepared for this future landscape. This particular methodology, landscape of futures, what we're trying to do is basically build a portfolio of capabilities that will allow us to be successful in any of these futures if they should arrive. Some of the futures are positive, they're very optimistic. Some of the futures are not as optimistic. So let's take a few minutes and take a look at a tool that can help us think about this landscape of possible futures, which will help us deal with this idea of uncertainty. Now, the tool set I'm going to talk about is a technique that comes from design thinking. So it is a design thinking strategy or approach to dealing with the future. Now, it's based on some work that actually has been done by the federal government. There was a project started about 2005, 2006 called Project Horizon. The project got started as an attempt to pull together a U.S. government or whole of government strategy to dealing with issues facing the U.S. government at the time. The people were able to bring together about 16 agencies to work on this, so it's an inter-organizational strategy process. The senior leadership of the team were the senior executives at many of these agencies. From DOD, 3-star, 4-star generals, from Coast Guard, 3-star, 4-star admirals participated, so it had fairly high-level senior leadership. All the players that participated put up people or cash, so the people were actually quite invested in it. The methodology itself was based on a methodology that was being used at the Coast Guard at the time called Evergreen. It's still being used successfully at the Coast Guard. The key idea behind Project Horizon is that it's looking at a landscape of futures rather than either a single future or some probabilistic futures. So the way Project Horizon worked is the first step was to find out what all the key drivers were that were of interest. So the key drivers were developed using interviews, questionnaires, and a Delphi technique to find out what the key drivers were. The Project Horizon team took the key driver set from all the interviews and came up with 75 key drivers. Now, the key drivers fall into the traditional category that you may be familiar with if you've ever done a step analysis: sociological, technological, economic, political, environmental factors. And they were able to boil those down into this set of 75 key drivers. So, for example, what would be the demographics of the United States in 2025 or 2030? What would be the demographics of Europe in 2025 or 2030? So they were able to identify what they thought the key drivers were and identify what, based on literature and research, what the relationships between the key drivers are. So if you have a workforce that's declining in size, what's the impact on your gross domestic product? So those were the kinds of relationships they were able to create. From that set of 75 drivers, they began to focus on developing a planning space by creating 4 dimensions. And then within those dimensions, they picked a couple that they were interested in. So the senior leadership picked threats to and security challenges that the United States might face in the year, in this case, 2025, and the economic conditions of the United States in the year 2025. Now, the date that was picked is somewhat arbitrary. They just wanted to get the date far enough out so that people didn't necessarily see the impact on their agencies immediately, so that people would actually get buy-in into the planning activity. Well, with the XY axis set up as threats and security challenges and economic challenges, the next step was to basically create some worlds. Now, these are what I call whole worlds, and these are different than traditional scenarios. Traditional scenarios tend to be what-if type scenarios, and they're partial worlds. These are all whole worlds. Every world is mutually exclusive, accounts for all 75 drivers, and is a complete world by itself. Now, the senior leadership team picked 5 worlds. The purpose of the spread is so that you've got a nice coverage of your planning space. So if you remember back to the previous slide, we're trying to make sure we have coverage for that landscape of futures. So you need at least 4 or 5 worlds. Okay? So these were the 5 worlds that were picked. So you see in the lower left-hand box, this is called Asian Way. And in Asian Way, the threats to U.S. national security are relatively low. That is, the U.S., for example, is still the world's leading military. However, the economic conditions aren't very good. So the economy of the world is being driven from Asian companies, not U.S. companies. Americans are moving to Asia to get jobs because the job market's better there. Chinese is primarily the language of choice in schools, high schools in the United States, because that's how you're going to get a job. The be careful what you wish for world is the one that's most like today, with one primary exception. There's fairly significant environmental issues in this world as a result of volcanic activity in the Pacific Rim, for example. So there's a lot of natural disasters and pandemics that have to be dealt with. Lower right-hand box is lockdown world. This is probably one of the more unpleasant worlds. This is a world where the United States has experienced several dirty bombs, terrorist attacks, pandemics. military forces don't go beyond the border of the United States, for example, in that particular world. The profits and principles world is a pretty interesting world. This is one where major corporations run the world. The U.S. government is in charge of almost nothing. And congagement is one world that our students struggle with quite a bit. This is a world in which governments are basically regional powers. So the U.S. is the #1 regional power in the Northern Hemisphere. And the Europeans are the regional power in Europe. The Chinese are the regional power in China. So what we do with, in this particular activity is, it's about a 3.5-day activity. Everybody is assigned to a world, and they spend 3.5 days in that world, trying to get used to that world and live in that world. So after a couple of days, they really think they're living in that world in 2025. We would sequester them, but we can't afford to do that. So we do let them go home at night. So we try to get everybody to really feel comfortable in their world. And we ask them to start to think about what it is, what kind of capabilities they would need to be successful in that world. Now, this methodology, this tool set, and these whole worlds are scalable. So this initial effort was designed for the U.S. government. So we pulled U.S. government employees from across all the agencies that participated together. But this is scalable in the sense that you could use the same scenario set at any federal agency and pull together stakeholders from that federal agency to participate in this activity. The U.S. Coast Guard, for example, has used this with all the maritime agencies in the executive branch. Same methodology. Similar set of worlds. They made some minor changes to it. You could use this set of worlds at Department of Housing and Urban Development with your stakeholders. Okay, to think about what capabilities HUD would need to be successful in these future worlds. So this is a scalable methodology. You could use this methodology for yourself to think about what capabilities you would need to be successful if any of these worlds happen to show up. There is a structured planning methodology that goes with this called capabilities-based planning, and this is the particular hierarchy. One of the keys is we try to get people to come to agreement on what the U.S. government capabilities are. And we do this through a stress testing methodology. So at the end of the activity, everybody comes back together and we stress test each of the capabilities that the 5 teams have developed against the other 4 worlds. And those handful of capabilities, which we try to keep at about 10, that stress test really well, those are the capabilities that would be useful regardless of which future shows up. Those are the capabilities you might need regardless of which future shows up. They'll help you be successful. Now, one of the keys that goes back to the issue brought up earlier about the budget is, well, how do you make this a reality? So you've come out of this activity, you've got this list of 10 capabilities. It's across the U.S. government, or it's across multiple agencies, or it's across your agency, or it's across your stakeholder set. The next step is to start to think about, well, what are the tasks or activities I could engage in at my agency that would contribute to building out some portion of the capability? Because no agency is going to build out the entire capability, or no sub-element of an agency is going to build out an entire capability. So this is where we ask people to start to think about the role that their agency can play in building out some component of the capability. And this is where budgeting starts to come in. If you look on the right-hand part of your diagram, you'll see there's something called a USG capabilities portfolio. One of the keys to make capabilities-based planning work is this idea of using a portfolio that allows you to think about investment opportunities that will contribute to building out the capability, the portfolio of capabilities over time, that you can begin to budget for those. And the decision process on the portfolio, there's really 2 decision components here when you look at the select phase. The initial select phase has to do with these are the proposals that we think fit really well into our portfolio, and then you move that portfolio forward for funding, then at some point you actually get the funding, which probably will be less than you asked for, and you go back through the portfolio process to make decisions about which investments you're going to invest in and which ones you're not going to invest in, to try and maintain your risk and value profile of your portfolio.
Okay, so unfortunately we have to end a little bit early, but we have time to kind of summarize, and I always have questions, as you know, and anybody who watches these every month knows. So I would ask this, Jeff. We talked a lot about a lot of very high-level kind of things, and a lot about concepts. So I would ask you, for our audience, what would be maybe the one or two things you think people could walk away from this presentation with and do at their desk and for their everyday work in their own organizations as a whole or their own teams? How can they apply some of these principles when they go right back to their desk at 11 o'clock? How can they do that?
Okay. Well, I think one of the things is try to get a better understanding of those key variables in their relationships, and then try to start to think about this future environment and what potential impact these different futures might have on those key variables and their relationships. But I think one of the things hopefully you could sort of take away from today is this idea that when you're planning for the uncertain future, you really need to look at a range of potential futures rather than invest a lot of energy in either these point predictions of a single clear enough future, or trying to create futures to which you can assign probabilities, and spending a lot of time and energy trying to assign probabilities, because basically the literature sort of and the research suggests that we're not very good at that.
Okay.
And that you really want to focus on a range of futures. And to identify what that range of futures might be, you need to start to think about, well, what are say the two or three things that are really important? You know, for example, on the chart we showed, we talked about future economic conditions, and we talked about the threats to national security. Well, you can make the XY axis almost anything you want, and then build a set of futures within that you can start to think about, and then begin to work on tasks or activities that'll help you be successful within the future, regardless of whichever future shows up, because none of those are likely to show up as is, as we've described.
Okay, that's great. So maybe what we can do, and I don't know how often this is done, I don't think it's done that often really, is do a little bit more scenario planning when it comes to our own organizations and our own problems, and really sort of think through what happens if this goes on, what happens if that goes on, what is the context I'm working in, and think about problems a lot more holistically. Might be a good way to do it also.
Right, think about problems more holistically.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, unfortunately, like I said, we have to end a little bit early. We are going to be taking a break in August, so there will not be a HUD OCIO learning session in August. But join us back in September, where we are going to have a discussion on building trust, building and sustaining trust in organizations and teams, which should be a very exciting session. So I hope all of you have a wonderful day, have a wonderful rest of the summer, and we'll see you back here in September. Thank you.
We talked a little bit about some of the components of what a strategic planning system is all about.
And one of the things that we believe that is very important is for us to take a look at the respective environments that we operate in.
So today we're going to learn about personality, the differences of personalities, and about relationships.